On Democracy by Robert A. Dahl, recited by the Catalyst Gamer. Part 1. The Beginning. Chapter 2. Where and how did democracy develop? A brief history. I started, you remember, by saying that democracy has been discussed off and on for 2,500 years. Is democracy really that old, you might wonder? Many Americans, and probably others as well, might believe that democracy began 200 years ago in the United States. Others, aware of its classical roots, would claim ancient Greece or Rome. Just where did it begin, and how did it evolve? It might please us to see democracy as more or less continuously advancing from its invention, so to speak, in ancient Greece 2,500 years ago, and spreading gradually outwards from that tiny beginning to the present day, when it has reached every continent and a substantial proportion of humanity. A pretty picture, but false for at least two reasons. First, as everyone acquainted with European history knows, after its early centuries in Greece and Rome, the rise of popular government turned into its decline and disappearance. Even if we were to allow ourselves considerable latitude in describing what governments we would count as popular, democratic, or republican, their rise and decline could not be portrayed as a steady upward climb to the distant summit, punctuated only by brief descents here and there. Instead, the course of democratic history would look like the path of a traveller crossing a flat and almost endless desert, broken by only a few hills, until the path finally begins the long climb to its present heights. Figure 1. Figure 1 shows that in 1860 only one country was democratic, whereas there were 40. This was of 37 countries. In 1870, only 2 countries were democratic, of a total of 39. In 1880, 3 of a total of 41. In 1890, 4 of a total of 42. In 1900, 6 of a total of 43. In 1910, 8 of a total of 48. In 1920, 15 of a total of 51. In 1930, 22 of a total of 64. In 1940, 19 of a total of 65. In 1950, 25 of a total of 75. In 1960, 36 of a total of 87. In 1970, 40 of a total of 119. In 1980, 37 of a total of 121. In 1990, 65 of a total of 192. In the second place, it would be a mistake to assume that democracy was just invented once and for all. As, for example, the steam engine was invented. When anthropologists and historians find that similar tools or practices have appeared in different times and places, they generally want to know how these separate appearances came about. Did the tools or practices spread by means of diffusion from its original inventors to the other groups, or instead, were they independently invented by different groups? Finding an answer too often difficult, perhaps impossible. So too is the development of democracy in the world. How much of its spread is to be explained simply by its diffusion from its early sources, and how much, if any, by its having been independently invented in different times and places? Although with democracy the answer is surrounded by a good deal of uncertainty, my reading of the historical record is in essence this: some of the expansion of democracy, perhaps a good deal of it, can be accounted for mainly by the diffusion of democratic ideas and practices. But diffusion cannot provide the whole explanation. Like fire or painting or writing, democracy seems to have been invented more than once, and in more than one place. After all, if the conditions were favourable for the invention of democracy at one time and place, in Athens, say, about 500 BCE, might not similar favourable conditions have existed elsewhere? I assume that democracy can be independently invented and reinvented wherever the appropriate conditions exist. And the appropriate conditions have existed, I believe, at different times and in different places. Just as a supply of tillable land and adequate rainfall have generally encouraged the development of agriculture, so certain favourable conditions have always supported a tendency towards the development of democratic government. For example, because of favourable conditions, some form of democracy probably existed for tribal governments long before recorded history. Consider this possibility. Certain people, we'll assume, make up a fairly well-bounded group. We, they, ourselves, and others, my people and their people, my tribe and other tribes. In addition, let's assume that the group, the tribe, let's say, is fairly independent of control by outsiders. The members of tribe can, and so to speak, more or less, run their own show without interference by outsiders. Finally, let's assume that a substantial number of the members of the group, perhaps the tribal elders, see themselves as being equal in being well qualified to have a say in governing the group. In these circumstances, democratic tendencies are, I believe, likely to arise. A push towards democratic participation develops out of what we might call the logic of equality. Over the long period when human beings lived together in small groups and survived by hunting game and collecting roots, fruits, berries, and other offerings of nature, they would no doubt have sometimes, perhaps usually, developed a system in which a good many of the members, animated by the logic of equality, the older or more experienced ones anyway, participated in whatever decisions they needed to make as a group. That such was indeed the case is strongly suggested by studies of non-literate tribal societies. For many thousands of years then, some form of primitive democracy may well have been most natural political system. We know, however, that this lengthy period came to an end when human beings began to settle down for long stretches of time in fixed communities, primarily for agriculture and trade. The kinds of circumstances favourable to popular participation in government that I just mentioned, group identity, little outside interference, and assumption of equality, seem to have become rare forms of hierarchy, and dominion came to be more natural. As a result, popular governments vanished among settled people for thousands of years. They were replaced by monarchies, despotisms, aristocracies, oligarchies, all based on some form of ranking or hierarchy. Then, around 500 BCE, in several places, favourable conditions seem to have reappeared, and a few small groups of people began to develop systems of government that provided fairly extensive opportunities to participate in group decisions. Primitive democracy, one might say, was reinvented in a more advanced form. The most crucial developments occurred in Europe, three along the Mediterranean coast, others in northern Europe. The Mediterranean. Was in classical Greece and Rome around 500 BCE that systems of government providing for popular participation by the substantial number of citizens were first established. On foundations so solid that with occasional changes they endured for centuries. Greece. Classical Greece was not a country in our modern sense, a place in which all Greeks lived within a single state, with a single government. Instead, Greece was composed of several hundred independent cities, each with its surrounding countryside. Unlike the United States, France, Japan, and other modern countries, the so-called nation-states, or national states, that have largely dominated the modern world, the sovereign states of Greece, were city-states. The most famous city-state, in classical times and after, was Athens. In 1507 BCE, the Athenians developed a system of popular government that lasted nearly 2 centuries, until the city was subjugated by its more powerful neighbour to the north, Macedonia. After 321 BCE, the Athenian government limped along under Macedonian control for generations. Then the city was subjugated again, this time by the Romans. It was the Greeks, probably the Athenians, who coined the term democracy or demoskratia, from the Greek words demos, meaning the people, and kratos, meaning to rule. It is interesting, by the way, that while in Athens the word demos usually referred to the entire Athenian people, sometimes it meant only the common people, or even just the poor. The word democracy, it appears, was sometimes used by its aristocrat critics as a kind of epithet, to show their disdain for the common people who had wrested away the aristocrats' previous control over the government. In any case, demoskratia was applied specifically by Athenians and other Greeks to the government of Athens, and of many other cities in Greece as well. Among the Greek democracies, that of Athens was far and away the most important, the best known then and today, of incomparable influence on political philosophy, and often held up later as a prime example of citizen participation, or as some would say, participatory democracy. The government of Athens was complex, too complex to describe adequately here. At its heart and centre was an embassy, in which all citizens were entitled to participate. The assembly elected a few key officials, generals, for example, odd as that may seem to us, but the main method for selecting citizens for the other public duties was by a lottery, in which eligible citizens stood an equal chance of being selected. According to some estimates, an ordinary citizen stood a fair chance of being chosen by lot once in his lifetime to serve as the most important presiding officer in the government. Although some Greek cities join in forming rudimentary representative governments for their alliances, leagues, and confederacies, primarily for common defence, little is known about the representative systems. They left virtually no impression on democratic ideas and practices, and none, essentially, on the latter form of representative democracy. Nor did the Athenian system of selecting citizens for public duties by lot ever become an acceptable alternative to elections as a way of choosing representatives. Thus, the political institutions of Greek democracy, innovative though they have been in their time, were ignored or even rejected outright during the development of the modern representative democracy. Rome. About the time that popular government was introduced in Greece, it also made its appearance on the Italian peninsula, in the city of Rome. The Romans, however, chose to call their system a republic, from res, meaning thing or affair, in Latin, and republicus, public. Loosely rendered, a republic was the thing that belonged to the people. I'll come back to these two words, democracy and republic. The right to participate in governing the republic was at first restricted to the patricians and aristocrats. But in a development that we shall encounter again, after much struggle, the common people, the plebs or plebeians, also gained entry. As in Athens, the right to participate was restricted to men, just as it was also in all latter democracies and republics until the 20th century. From its beginnings as a city quite modest in size, the Roman Republic expanded by means of annexation and conquest far beyond the old city's boundaries. As a result, the Republic came to rule over all of Italy and far beyond. What is more, the Republic often conferred Roman citizenship, which was highly valued on conquered peoples, who thus became not mere subjects, but Roman citizens fully entitled to a citizen's rights and privileged. Wise and generous as this gift was, if we judge Rome from today's perspective, we discover an enormous defect. Rome never adequately adjusted or adapted its institutions of popular government to the huge increase in the number of citizens and their great geographical distances from Rome. Oddly, our present point of view, the assemblies in which Roman citizens were entitled to participate, could, meeting as before were in the city of Rome, in the view forum that tourists still see today, in ruins. But for most Roman citizens living in the far-flung territories of the Republic, the city was too far away to attend, at least without extraordinary effort and expense. Consequently, an increasing and ultimately overwhelming number of citizens were, as a practical matter, denied the opportunity to participate in the citizens' assemblies, the centre of the Roman system of government. It was rather as if American citizenship had been conferred on the people in the various states as the country expanded, even though people in the new states could only exercise their right to vote in national elections by showing up in Washington, D.C. Although the Romans were a highly creative and practical people, from their practice of electing certain important officials in citizen assemblies, they never developed a workable system of representative government based on democratically elected representatives.